Alright, so on Saturday night, Zurdo Ramirez successfully defended his unified WBO and WBA cruiserweight titles against his WBA mandatory challenger Curiel Dorton by way of a 12-round unanimous decision. This was the widely expected result due to Dorton's recent absence from top-level fights. Now that Ramirez took care of that mandatory, surely he can now unify his cruiserweight world title belt with the IBF champion Jai Opetaia. Ramirez vs Opetaia is the fight in the cruiserweight division that there is the most demand for by far, and this has been the case for a while now. Needless to say, this was the fight we wanted in the division before Ramirez's recent fight with Dorton was announced, and before Ramirez even became a unified champ against Billum Smith last year and he was just the WBA champ. The Ramirez vs Opetaia fight was the desired unification in the division back then too, by Team Opetaia and the fans at least. Most boxing fans are in unanimous agreement that Zurdo Ramirez has been ducking that unification of Jai Opetaia. Opetaia is the A champion of the division, but he's having to knock over bums because he can't get the unifications, mainly the one with Zurdo. That's the issue here. But today, we're going to be discussing the very lucrative stage on which a Zurdo Ramirez vs Jai Opetaia fight could take place, that being a Matchroom vs Golden Boy 5 vs 5 card, an event that would almost certainly be a Riyadh season event. And money talks, so if there's anything that will opt Ramirez to take the Opetaia fight, it will be the Arab money that His Excellency will be putting on the table. Zurdo Ramirez fights under Oscar De La Hoya's Golden Boy Promotions, and Jai Opetaia fights under Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Boxing, two promotional stables which broadcast their events on the DAZN platform, and are both Riyadh season affiliated, so this should be an easy event to stage, surely. Oscar De La Hoya and Eddie Hearn have had a bit of a rivalry in recent history, one might say, friendly banter with some personal digs in there, but in the way of business, they are both often spoken separately or to each other about their fighters going head to head on a 5 vs 5 style card potentially, but in terms of the business they've actually done with each other, well, we are midway through the year, and if I remember correctly, we've only seen two Matchroom vs Golden Boy head to head bouts this year, two high level fights that happened within a week of each other. Back on February 15th, Golden Boy's Arnold Barboza came to England and headlined a Matchroom show against Matchroom's Jack Catterall. Barboza outboxed Catterall and won a 12-round split decision to become the WBO interim super lightweight champ. And there was another Matchroom vs Golden Boy interim world title fight the very next week on February 22nd, as Golden Boy's Virgil Ortiz put his WBC interim super welterweight title on the line against Matchroom's Israel Madrimov on the Big Beterbiev vs Bivol 2 card, a multi-promotional Riyadh season show. In that fight, Virgil Ortiz defeated Madrimov by a 12-round unanimous decision to successfully defend his interim strap. So in February, Golden Boy went 2-0 over Matchroom, and that's the overall record this year. So Oscar De La Hoya has the upper hand over his rival Eddie Hearn. We do actually have a Matchroom vs Golden Boy fight coming up in the very near future, as Matchroom Shakur Stevenson takes on Golden Boy's William Zepeda on the 12th. Shakur's WBC lightweight title is on the line in that one. Shakur Stevenson is the one very expected to win that fight, but he's not a Matchroom guy per se. This fight is his second fight on what is only a 2-fight deal with Matchroom as far as we know. But either way, he's stepping in as a Matchroom promoted fighter, so this fight of course affects the head-to-head record between Matchroom and Golden Boy that little weirdos like me care about. Now this 5 vs 5 concept has been seen just one time thus far, so let's run through how that went to remind ourselves what this all looks like. Last year, Turkel Al-Sheikh set up the 5 vs 5 between long-time UK-based rival promotional entities in Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Boxing and Frank Warren's Queensberry Promotions, a card that took place in Riyadh. That was meant to be the undercard of the undisputed light heavyweight title fight between Dmitry Bivol and Artur Beterbiev, but Beterbiev had to pull out of that fight due to injury, and that fight got postponed to later in the year. So Bivol just made a voluntary defense of his WBA belt against Malik Zinad that went down in the middle of the 5 vs 5, and the main 5 vs 5 fight became the new main event. So the original cancellation of Bivol Beterbiev kinda made the 5 vs 5 bigger, because otherwise the 5 vs 5 wouldn't have actually been the main focus of that night. So the fights on the card were Matchroom's Ray Ford vs Queensberry's Nick Ball, with Ford's WBA featherweight title on the line. The light heavyweight bout between Matchroom's Craig Richards and Queensberry's Willie Hutchinson. The middleweight bout between Matchroom's Austin Williams and Queensberry's Hamza Shiraz. The interim IBF heavyweight title fight between Matchroom's Filip Hrgovic and Queensberry's Daniel Dubois. And the heavyweight main event between Matchroom's Deontay Wilder and Queensberry's Zhilei Zhang. It would have been ideal for both promotions to have guys who belong to their promotion through and through representing them in such an event, but the two guys representing Matchroom in both the main event and the co-main event were not Matchroom boys like that. Well, Filip Hrgovic had been a mainstay on Matchroom shows for the last few years at that point, but he was always on some co-promotional fight-by-fight deal type thing as opposed to being fully signed to them as far as I know. But as for Deontay Wilder in the main event, he was literally not a Matchroom guy whatsoever. He was the furthest thing from a Matchroom guy after that whole ordeal with the negotiations with Anthony Joshua falling through back in the day. But Eddie Hearn literally signed Wilder on a one-fight deal to represent Matchroom on this 5 vs 5 joint. Now the point system for the 5 vs 5 went as follows. 1 point for the promotion if their guy wins a fight on points, 2 points for the promotion if their guy wins a fight by stoppage, and each team elected a team captain who got double points for their victory, meaning 2 points earned by their captain if they win on points, and 4 points earned by their captain if their captain wins by KO. So you of course want to select a captain who is likely to win by KO to get those big 4 points. Eddie Hearn made Deontay Wilder the Matchroom captain, and Frank Warren made Hamza Shiraz the Queensberry captain. Now as for the final score in this event, well, Queensberry would famously clean sweep Matchroom 10 points to 0. Nick Ball defeated Ray Ford on points to become the new WBA World Featherweight Champ and to put Queensberry 1-0 up. Then Willie Hutchinson beat Craig Richards on points to put Queensberry 2 up, so 2 wins in 2, but they were both on points and Matchroom's captain was yet to fight, so Matchroom could still very much turn things around. But Queensberry's captain Hamza Shiraz was up next, and he stopped Ammo Williams to gain the big 4 points. So after 3 fights, Queensberry were 6-0 up, and it was already impossible for Matchroom to win. Yes, even if both the heavyweights won by stoppage, they'll get a draw at best, so things had to go perfectly just to get a draw. But both the heavyweights ended up losing by stoppage, so that's how it ended up being 10-0 to Queensberry. Despite the one-sided outcome of that 5 vs 5, and the fact that it wasn't stacked from top to bottom with massive worldwide names, it's fair to say that it was quite a successful event. It was a fun one for sure. Since that event took place over a year ago now, there have been talks about another Matchroom vs Queensberry 5 vs 5 card, and 5 vs 5 card between other promotions, mainly between Matchroom boxing and other promotions. As Eddie Hearn is the one who's gone on about it the most, guess he can't get over how bad the first one went for him. And yeah, the main 5 vs 5 card that has been spoken about other than Matchroom vs Queensberry Part 2 is the Matchroom vs Golden Boy card. So let's finally get into how a Matchroom vs Golden Boy card could actually look. I'm going to keep it relatively realistic but with a good bit of optimism in there too. I'll say now that I'm about to build a card that will look better than the Matchroom vs Queensberry card, as the thumbnail probably gives away. Oh, and one more very important thing before I get into it, this card would hypothetically take place later this year, probably towards the very end of the year. So for everyone I put on the card, this will likely be their next fight, unless I trust them to make a quick turnaround after other business they may have to take care of. So okay, the first of the 2 fights I'm going to be putting on the Matchroom vs Golden Boy 5 vs 5 card are very random, but it's not as if the Matchroom vs Queensberry one didn't have kind of random matchups. So for me, this hypothetical card would open up with a super lightweight bout between Matchroom's Dalton Smith and Golden Boy's Oscar Dwarte. I've had to do some fact checking about upcoming fights while looking at both the Matchroom and Golden Boy rosters and choosing the fights before putting this video together, and there was a lot of fights that I liked the look of but couldn't make for various reasons. But there was a spanner in the works for this one, so there is a catch with the very first fight here unfortunately. Now Oscar Dwarte was announced to fight Kenneth Sims Jr. on August 2nd, an announcement that was made just 3 weeks ago I think. Now I can't find any news about that fight being officially cancelled, but Sims Jr. is listed as suspended until August 14th on his box rec, a date after their scheduled bout. So he'd still be suspended by the day they're meant to fight. And this fight is not listed as a scheduled bout on neither Dwarte nor Sims' box rec. Of course, this fight could be rescheduled, but let's say it doesn't get rescheduled for the sake of this video, because Dwarte vs Sims Jr. was meant to happen before but didn't. So yeah, to me, this Dalton Smith vs Oscar Dwarte fight just makes a lot of sense. Dalton Smith is the WBC Silver Super Lightweight Champ, in line to fight for the full WBC title at 140, which is about to be contested for on the Ring 3 card, as Alberto Puello puts the belt on the line against Subriel Matias in what is a 50-50 fight on paper. So Dalton Smith should fight a guy who would get him ready for that WBC title shot against either Puello or Matias. But it should also be a fight that Dalton Smith would be quite a big favourite in, so he's not so likely to lose his number 1 position. So Oscar Dwarte is a solid fighter. He is most known for his stoppage loss to Ryan Garcia in 2023. Garcia is the big star at Golden Boy Promotions, but his ongoing internal conflict with his boss Oscar De La Hoya, and Bernard Hopkins as well to be honest, was at an all-time high at that point in 2023. And Dwarte was like the guy who Oscar and B-Hop were bringing in to beat Ryan. But Ryan won the fight of course and actually humbled Dwarte quite badly. But since then, Dwarte has gone on a pretty decent 3-fight winning streak. He defeated former world champion Jojo Diaz by a 9th round TKO. He then beat Bortozon Akhmedov by a 10-round decision in a fun fight, Akhmedov who has been the rounds with the best of him. And then in Duarte's most recent fight, he stopped Miguel Madueño, the same Madueño who had just given Keyshawn Davis 10 tough rounds. And most of all, Dwarte has a really fun fighting style, so he is a valid guy to have in the opener of the 5 vs 5. Now, Dalton Smith's 2 recent fights were not really competitive, but the fact that he has been so dominant at European level shows that he is ready for world level. But as his last opponents didn't provide too much of a test at all, despite Smith being the WBC number 1, jumping straight into an Alberto Puello fight or a Subriel Matias fight after fighting Wilde Weezer and Matteo Germain might not be the very best idea, as Matias and Puello both have their fair share of world title fight experience and Dalton Smith has none. Dalton Smith beating Oscar Dwarte is not a given at all, but Dwarte is also a guy who has no world title fight experience, and Dwarte knows how to lose. I do envisage the bookies having the undefeated Dalton Smith as quite the favourite in this hypothetical matchup, like a 2-7 favourite or something. So this fight is a realistic one that I'm sure both promoters would definitely be happy to take, which is why I'm putting it in here. But in terms of a 50-50 Matchroom vs Golden Boy fight at super lightweight, I'd put Dalton Smith against Arnold Barboza. Well, this would either be a 50-50 or Barboza would actually be a slight favourite. Barboza is of course coming off of his loss to Teofimo Lopez in what was quite a dominant decision loss for his first world title shot. A shot that he got after grinding his way to that WBO mandatory position, going 32-0 and getting some big wins to get to that position. But coming off of the loss, if Barboza took a second consecutive L, then it would be looking rough for his career. And as for Dalton Smith, it would be really rough for him to lose his number 1 position that he's built up to by putting it on the line against Arnold Barboza. So Dalton Smith versus Arnold Barboza would be a 50-50 fight that is so high jeopardy for both guys, which is why I love it. But the same reason I love it is the same reason that I reckon each promoter won't want to put their guy in a position like this. With the position both men are in now, they both need to win their next fights. But against each other, both of them have such a high chance of losing, so it's techie. I know we do 50-50 fights in Riyadh season, but yeah, I don't think Eddie Hearn and Oscar De La Hoya would see Smith versus Barboza as good business at all. Maybe I'll stand corrected, who knows. But yeah, I just see Smith versus Dwarte as a more realistic fight to be made. Also again, Dwarte has such a fan-friendly style, definitely more fan-friendly than Barboza. So although I like the 50-50 nature of Dalton Smith vs Arnold Barboza, Oscar Dwarte does have a really fun fighting style, so he's a good card opener, and this fight is way more realistic in terms of both promoters' probable willingness to make the fights. Fight number 2 on the card is Raal Curiel vs Conor Walker, a welterweight bout. This is another very random one. Of course, Curiel was the Golden Boy fighter here, and Walker is the Matchroom one. This fight sort of evened things out because in the last fight, the Matchroom guy in Dalton Smith would be the big favourite. But in this one, the Golden Boy guy in Curiel would be the big favourite. But don't worry, the next 2 fights after this are pretty much 50-50s. Now, I wanted to make this fight Raal Curiel vs Jack Catterall, but Catterall makes his welterweight debut this Saturday against Harlem Eubank. Well, that's Catterall's first notable fight at 147, and he hasn't fought at 147 in years. Now, I'm not basing another one of these hypothetical fights on a big variable. I'm not that confident that Catterall beats Harlem Eubank, and even if he does, he might go right back down to 140 after this fight if a big opportunity arises, because he said he can still make 140 easy, and he would still go for gold down there too. But if Catterall does beat Harlem Eubank and stays at 147, Catterall would then be Matchroom's main welterweight now that Boots is up at 54. Well, apart from one guy who we will get into in the unrealistic fantasy version of this 5 vs 5 card later. And Curiel has got good notoriety now after getting a stoppage win on the Jake Paul undercard, and he's an undefeated and decently ranked 147 pounder. So Curiel does have good hype around him now. And although I think him and Catterall would be a big 147 pound fight for the Matchroom Golden Boy card, with all those variables at play on the part of Catterall, I did just kind of throw in Conor Walker. But Curiel versus Walker should really be a good one. Conor Walker does have 3 losses on his record and doesn't have a place in the world welterweight top 15s, but he's on a good run right now and he is a fun fighter. Walker's last loss was to Lewis Crocker last year, but that was a close decision loss in which Walker gave a good showing of himself against a guy in Crocker who went on to become the IBF number 1 in the weight class. Walker then went on a 3-fight winning streak after the loss to Crocker. He beat Lewis Ritson by a 10-round unanimous decision. He then had a huge come-from-behind KO victory over Harry Scarf to become the British and Commonwealth welterweight champ earlier in the year, and then Walker just defended his British title against Liam Taylor by stoppage in an exciting performance just the other week. So Raal Curiel and Conor Walker are both known to be exciting fighters, and I don't see how a fight against each other wouldn't be exciting. This is a similar situation to the last fight I put on this card, to be honest. Dalton Smith versus Arnold Barboza is a more desirable fight in terms of both men's rankings and the risk factor for both guys, but Smith vs Dwarte is probably more fun and is more likely to be made. This time, we've got Jack Catterall, who is a way bigger name than Conor Walker, who could represent Matchroom against Curiel, but there are less variables at play that would prevent Conor Walker from being in this fight. Because I'm not going to lie, if Catterall loses to Harlem Eubank, then Walker has way more momentum than Catterall, as Catterall would be coming off of 2 losses, and Conor Walker would have more of a fun fight against Curiel than Jack Catterall would. And the really funny part is that Arnold Barboza and Jack Catterall had a fairly boring fight against each other earlier in the year, and I'm leaving both of those two out of this hypothetical 5 vs 5 card for various reasons. Now, the undefeated Raal Curiel does have a blemish on his record, which was his 12-round draw with fellow Golden Boy welterweight Alexis Rocha, but Rocha was the much more seasoned and higher ranked fighter there, and Curiel came in as the underdog in that one, and it wound up being a pretty enjoyable all-Mexican affair, and Curiel didn't lose the fight, so his stock definitely didn't go down in that one, let's just say that. So yeah, Curiel Walker, it really should be a fun fight. And Curiel brings that sort of Hispanic fan base which a lot of Golden Boy guys have, and Curiel has been with Golden Boy since he turned pro. And Conor Walker has been a mainstay on those big domestic non-pay-per-view Matchroom cards for his last 6 bouts, and has now built a decent reputation here in England. So although Matchroom and Golden Boy both have international rosters, this fight would be like a war between a beloved Latin American guy and a beloved UK guy, the 2 most prominent fan bases of each promotional brand of course. And I know Dalton Smith vs Oscar Dwarte and then Raal Curiel vs Conor Walker aren't massive name fights by Riyadh season standards, but they both ought to be bangers and they're both realistic, so starting out with these 2 would be valid, I'd say. So fight number 3 on the card would be a lightweight bout between Matchroom's Andy Cruz and Golden Boy's Floyd Scofield. Just like Raal Curiel, Scofield is another guy who just fought on the undercard of the Paul vs Chavez and Ramirez vs Dorton doubleheader. Floyd Scofield shone with a big round 1 knockout over Tevin Farmer. Whatever happened there. Fuck! Now, much like Dalton Smith, Andy Cruz is a guy who's literally in line to fight for a world title. In this case, he is in line for the IBF lightweight title, as his recent victory over Hironori Mashiro was an IBF eliminator. And as for Floyd Scofield, well, he is high up in the WBA rankings, and the WBA champ at lightweight is Tank Davis. But Scofield also has history with the WBC champ Shakur Stevenson, after Scofield was meant to challenge for Shakur's belt, but Scofield fell ill last minute and had to pull out. And even if Zepeda beat Stevenson for that WBC strap, Scofield vs Zepeda would make sense, as that is an all Golden Boy affair, and Scofield just stopped a guy in 1 round who gave Zepeda 22 very tough rounds. So pretty much, the issue here is that one of, if not both of these guys, ought to be fighting for a world title next. But you have to excuse me here. I don't know if you guys can tell so far, but I am giving contrived justifications for the matchups I'm choosing here to satisfy the 5 vs 5 concept. But I suppose that's what Matchroom and Golden Boy will actually have to do in real life to give us the best product possible on this particular card. Now, this fight doesn't have to be a non-world title fight. Andy Cruz is in line for Ray Murataya's IBF lightweight title, and I think Cruz is very capable of beating Murataya for that belt. And from what I can tell, Andy Cruz's promoter Eddie Hearn is looking to make Andy Cruz vs Ray Murataya for the IBF title as soon as possible. So if this Matchroom vs Golden Boy card happens at the end of the year, and Cruz is willing to make a pretty quick turnaround after the world title fight, or if he actually beats Murataya, Cruz vs Scofield can actually be an IBF lightweight title fight, with Scofield challenging for Cruz's belt. So this fight would be the first world title fight on this Matchroom vs Golden Boy card. And Scofield does have a decent ranking with the IBF, so it would be a valid voluntary defense for Cruz on a big card. This is a really interesting matchup, especially given the very recent hype around Floyd Scofield. Andy Cruz should be the favourite here due to his superior skill set and the lack of vulnerability on display from him thus far, but it's a live matchup and the odds wouldn't be too wide at all. I know this fight I'm presenting here is out of the blue and there are other matchups that you might rather see even manning more, but there's a good chance that we don't get those other fights, and this is a great matchup that I'd be thankful for if it got made. And most importantly, it of course suits the Matchroom vs Golden Boy concept. Okay, now the co-main event would be a super welterweight bout between Matchroom's Deron Boots Ennis and Golden Boy's Virgil Ortiz. This is a big one and would be the main event if the actual main event wasn't a 3-belt unification in a heavier weight class. This fight is actually kind of the most unrealistic on the hypothetical 5 vs 5 card, as I'm setting this card to be built around the Jaya Pataya vs Zurdo Ramirez main event. But Deron Ennis vs Virgil Ortiz is definitely a main event worthy fight itself, and is perhaps worthy of saving for another big card to headline, especially given that this is Deron Ennis' anticipated 154-pound debut after dropping the welterweight world titles that he held. Now, this fight was briefly meant to happen on the cursed undercard of Bivol vs Beterbiev 2 back in February, but talks fell through and Boots was then replaced by Israel Madjamov. This is a topic of discussion that we're liable to go on a very long tangent about, so I'll just leave that there. But when Virgil Ortiz fought Madrimov, Ortiz beat Madrimov to successfully defend his WBC interim belt, as I mentioned earlier. And Deron went on to become a unified champ at 47 instead, picking up the WBA belt from Stanionis. But now Boots is really going up to 154, surely they can make this fight as the Matchroom vs Golden Boy 5 vs 5 card co-main event. And as for it not being the main event, well, it wasn't even meant to be the co-main event on the Bivol Beterbiev 2 card. It wasn't even meant to be the fight before the co-main event, in fact. So with Riyadh season money, it's no longer imperative that a fight like this shall be a main event. This fight does have a lot of story to it, of course, as it was meant to be made before. Boots is one of Eddie Hearn's main guys, and Ortiz is one of De La Hoya's main guys. Ortiz, who has already beat a Matchroom guy in Madrimov. And this is literally a 50-50 fight. So this would probably actually be seen as the main event by a large section of fans. Probably over in the States. Especially given that it is way closer on the odds than the would-be main event. And this is a fight in demand anyway. It's not just in demand because of world title belts, like the would-be main event. But now, it's not a thing where Boots is rolling the dice to step up in weight. It is big that the move up in weight is official now as he dropped the welterweight titles, don't get me wrong, but he's just going to be cutting less weight here. And he's probably actually bigger than Ortiz, who was only down at 47 a couple years ago himself. As for world title implications here, well, Ortiz is the interim WBC champ, and the chances of him being upgraded to full champion as the current full champion Sebastian Fundora won't fight him are fairly high. So Boots vs Ortiz could end up being a full WBC world title fight. You know, maybe if Fundora and Tim Tszyu have a trilogy or something. Or Boots vs Ortiz could be for the interim, but the winner would be upgraded shortly after the win. Or the winner could actually just go fight Fundora for the full title after, if the fight could be made. You know, it depends on a bunch of variables. So the main event, the fight that this whole card would be built around, of course, would be Golden Boy's Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez versus Matchroom's Jai Opetaia for the WBA, WBO, IBF and Ring Magazine World Cruiserweight titles. This fight would bring us just one step away from having an undisputed cruiserweight champion of the world, with Badou Jack's WBC title still up in the balance. You know, he's got the mandated rematch with Mikhailian ordered. And now you've got Shieslak waiting in the wings with his newly won WBC interim cruiserweight strap. But yeah, Opetaia versus Zurdo settles 3 of the 4 governing body belts, and Opetaia's ring belts would be on the line too. Jai Opetaia is widely regarded as the best cruiserweight in the world and would be a massive favourite here. And people are leaning even more towards Opetaia now, as they say Zurdo didn't look too great against Dorton on the weekend, getting caught with shots quite a bit and he didn't look too sharp. Zurdo is kind of regarded as a weak unified champion. He doesn't look ostensibly great and he's not so athletic, but he is a good boxer. You don't become a unified champ by being rubbish. But there's still levels between him and Opetaia, and that's why Zurdo has pretty much ducked him. So although I'm not one of those who think that Zurdo is literally a bum and would get blown away in a round by Opetaia, I do still very much pick Opetaia to beat him, and all the existing narratives around this potential fight do make sense. You know, the ducking talks and the talks that Opetaia would stop him. This is a valid main event for the 5 vs 5 because Opetaia is one of Matchroom's top guys, and Zurdo Ramirez now, he ain't Golden Boy's biggest star, but he is Golden Boy's only unified champion other than Oscar Collazo, who fights all the way down at minimum weight. So in some regard, Zurdo could be deemed as Golden Boy's top guy. He's for sure their top guy in the upper weight classes. Okay, so this is how the card looks. A fairly realistic yet fairly optimistic Golden Boy vs Matchroom 5 vs 5 card that could take place later in the year. Oh, by the way, I made this graphic before Matchroom announced their new shit logo, so yeah, I couldn't be bothered to change it.
We are going to get hammered for this on socials.
So it'd kick off with Dalton Smith vs Oscar Dwarte, then followed up by Raal Curiel vs Conor Walker. Next up would be Andy Cruz vs Floyd Scofield. Then the co-main event would be Virgil Ortiz Jr. vs Deron. And of course Jai Opetaia vs Gilberto Ramirez would be the main event. Again, I did contrive a lot of my explanations for why these fights should happen to fit this interpromotional 5 vs 5 concept, so I hope you guys understand that. Also, apologies if I got anything wrong here, or if there are reasons why any of these fights can't happen that I missed out. I tried to include all of the relevant information here, but I am a filthy rotten casual, so I probably have missed out a major piece of information or two here. This of course looks better than last year's Matchroom vs Queensberry card on paper. Do let me know if you disagree. But those Matchroom vs Queensberry fights did deliver in the ring, so let's hope that these do too. I'm saying it like it's going to happen. Matchroom vs Queensberry only had one world title fight in Nick Ball vs Ray Ford, and if this Matchroom vs Golden Boy card was to take place right now, it would also only have one world title fight, which would be Ramirez vs Opetaia. But that is a unification, so it's bigger than Ball vs Ford. And a card of these very fights could have up to 3 world title fights by the time it happens, if Virgil Ortiz gets upgraded to full WBC champ and Andy Cruz quickly grabs the IBF belt from Murataya and makes a swift turnaround. So a lot has to happen for there to be 3 world title fights here, so let's be realistic and just say that there's one big world title fight unification in the main event, and one of the 2 fights below it might end up being for a world title. But this would be bigger than Matchroom vs Queensberry either way. To predict how each fight would go, so Smith vs Dwarte. Even though I see the bookies having Smith as a favourite, I find it hard to see him completely outboxing Dwarte. Duarte's relentless pressure is hard to deal with, but gun to my head, just because Dwarte's been stopped before, I'll just go over Dorton Smith knockout. I reckon Dwarte leaves himself too open until he gets stopped later on. Curiel and Walker, both fun fighters and solid fighters who can get stuck in, but I reckon Curiel packs more of a punch than Walker, so his shots will do more damage and Walker will get worn down a bit as it goes on and start concede a lot of the rounds to Curiel, but Walker will make it the distance, so I'll say Curiel points here. Cruz vs Scofield. We've seen Scofield look good against a low level of competition over the rounds and look amazing for 1 round or even less than a round when he got a top name out of there in the first, but I don't see him knocking out Andy Cruz like that, and I do reckon that Andy Cruz has shown to be the better boxer than Scofield. He's got that slick Cuban amateur style and he's adapted to the pros by learning to sit down on his shots under the guidance of trainer Bozy Ennis, the father of the man above him on this hypothetical card. So you know what, I'll say Cruz points. Maybe me doubting Floyd Scofield is cursed, but this is just hypothetical. I'll look into it more if this fight does get made, but I don't see myself predicting anything other than Cruz points if I read into it. Ortiz vs Ennis. There are a few reasons to go with Ortiz. He's got the more experience at 154. Some people say Boots docked Ortiz before, and some might say that Ortiz has looked consistently good against a better level of competition than Boots has faced. But Boots Ennis, he's from Philly, you hear me? So for that particular reason, I'd have to pick Boots Ennis to win this one. And the main event, I've got an Opataya win. I'm convinced that he wins, but I'm not all the way sure he gets the KO. The odds will probably favour an Opataya KO, but Opataya has only fought a former or current world champion twice, and that was his 2 fights against Myris Breedis, and Opataya didn't stop Breedis either time across those 24 rounds. And Ramirez's resume is actually way more stacked than Opataya's. Ramirez has only lost once, which was to Bivol down at light heavy, and he has never been stopped or even dropped before. So you know what, gun to my head, I'm actually going to say Opataya points. Now even though this hypothetical card may seem somewhat unrealistic, I quickly cooked up an even more unrealistic Matchroom vs Golden Boy card. Well, it's mainly unrealistic because of one fight, but anyway, let me just show it now. Bosh. So yeah, obviously the Conor Benn vs Ryan Garcia fight is the one that makes it unrealistic. Oh, and please note that this wouldn't be my elected order of the card, I just threw it together quick. Well, of course, Curiel vs Catterall would be the opener. So Conor Benn will now rematch Chris Eubank Jr. in September, I think, up at middleweight again, so this Matchroom vs Golden Boy joint would likely have to be next year for this to happen. And Ryan Garcia just lost a shutout to Rolly Romero in his welterweight debut, and who knows whether Ryan Garcia recovers from that abysmal performance anytime soon. Conor Benn vs Ryan Garcia would be a welterweight bout, and Conor Benn is still listed as a welterweight on the Matchroom roster, but he's going to have fought twice up at middleweight this year, and he hasn't fought at welterweight since, 2022, and who's to say that he'll be asked to go all the way back down to 147 after getting that Eubank bag again. So Benn vs Garcia is iffy on both sides. Also, these fights wouldn't all fit on the card at once, let's just be real, it wouldn't happen. After the Eubank Jr. rematch, Benn would have also main evented a stadium show twice in a row, so although no fighter is bigger than the sport in this Riyadh season setup, I reckon Conor Benn would only be in main events from now on, unless he's like co-main event in AJ vs Fury at Wembley or something. Yep, that's right, with all the names on the card, Conor Benn is the one that'd have an issue not main eventing. What's the whole character? And yeah, as you can see, I remade Shakur Stevenson vs Floyd Scofield after their fight on the Bivol Beterbiev 2 undercard got cancelled. Now this fight in itself is not unrealistic, as it got made before and Scofield is now more deserving of a world title shot after his win over Farmer, but this is a matter of Shakur signing an extension with Matchroom Boxing after the Zepeda fight, which is not a given at all. On that note, if Zepeda and Shakur have a close fight and there's a rematch between them, you could of course have Shakur vs Zepeda 2 on here instead. And if Shakur does sign an extension with Matchroom, Shakur vs Zepeda 2 could easily headline a Matchroom vs Golden Boy card, if Zurdo Ramirez keeps stuck in Opataya, let's say, and that fight doesn't happen. I know the card is built around that cruiserweight unification, but they do want to do the 5 vs 5 card anyway. There's a good chance that Ramirez still docks Opataya, and yeah, a Shakur vs Zepeda rematch would be a very fitting fight to build the card around. Alright, in terms of the order of the card talk for this card that would never happen, let's just waffle about that quickly now. Alright, so looking at the fights here, let me be real, I don't care about the star power of Ryan Garcia and the fact that he headlined that Times Square triple header over Devin Haney and Teofimo Lopez's fight actually being a world title fight. And I don't care if Ben had a couple gimmick fights with Eubank that, did loads of numbers. Neither Ben nor Garcia have ever been a world champion, so the cruiserweight unification obviously must go on last over them. Now Ben vs Garcia could be the co-main event, but that means that neither Shakur Stevenson vs Floyd Scofield nor Boots Ennis vs Virgil Ortiz could be the co-main, and one of them would have to be 3 down from the main event. Well, let's say Boots vs Ortiz wasn't for the full world title in the end. That fight could be 3 down from the main event, and Shakur vs Scofield would be the one before the co-main. That's an easy decision to make, as Shakur vs Scofield for the WBC title was meant to be beneath the co-main on the Bivol Beterbiev 2 card, below the co-main event that ended up being Joseph Parker vs Martin Bakole. And Ennis was meant to be in place of Matchroom fighting Virgil Ortiz there, and that fight was actually 4 fights below the main event. So simply put, both of these fights were meant to be on the Bivol Beterbiev 2 card, and both were meant to be under the co-main event. So this could all work, but yeah, I highly doubt it because of the Ben vs Garcia fight. Oh, and Shakur re-signing with Matchroom ain't looking all so likely. This one here is just a delusional fantasy 5 vs 5 card, and now this one is the more realistic original card I cooked up, with from top to bottom Oscar Dwarte vs Dorton Smith, Raal Curiel vs Conor Walker, Floyd Scofield vs Andy Cruz, Virgil Ortiz Jr. vs Deron Ennis, and Gilberto Ramirez vs Jaya Padilla. Alright, so 3 guys on that 5 vs 5 card that I just built fought on the undercard of Jake Paul vs Julio Cesar Chavez, that being Zodo Ramirez, Floyd Scofield, and Raal Curiel. And I of course dedicated a lengthy pre-fight video to Floyd Scofield's fight with Tevin Farmer, in which I predicted Tevin Farmer to win, and then Scofield knocked Farmer out in round 1.
I ain't gonna lie, I'm getting cooked. Same thing.
Look, that video wasn't just a prediction video. I spoke a lot about Tevin Farmer's last 3 fights, and I still stick by everything I said about Farmer's 3 consecutive losses going into this fight, against Ray Murataya and against William Zepeda twice. Go watch the video if you haven't already and you want to know just what I think about those fights. And I said in that pre-fight video that I'll give Floyd Scofield great credit if he beats Farmer due to the nature of Farmer's 3 losses going into the fight, and then Scofield did it in the best way possible. So if anyone ever dares to discredit this win by saying that Scofield just beat a guy coming off of 3 losses, I've got Scofield's back. This result really increases Scofield's chances of beating a lot of fighters in my book, fighters who I would have had beaten him before, but there are still a handful of lightweights that have beaten Scofield. It was a peach of a right hand that Scofield landed for the first knockdown. They say a right hand is the money shot on a southpaw, but it's not like you just lead with a right hand at will against an evasive slickster like Farmer. But Scofield feigned to the right, then pulled out and blinded Farmer with the left as he stepped out to the side to create an angle to land the perfect right hand to drop Farmer hard just over 30 seconds into the fight. Farmer valiantly made the count, then Scofield rushed Farmer, then put him down again with a solid left hook this time. Farmer valiantly made the count again, and then Scofield's pursuit after the second knockdown led to the referee stopping the fight. Big stoppage victory for Floyd Scofield there. Now Tevin Farmer reckons this was an early stoppage that he was on the receiving end of. If I say it was early, then that's just cope. So I'll have to ask you guys if you can envisage a world where the ref doesn't stop the fight at the point he did, Farmer makes it out of the round by clinching and surviving, then Scofield slows the work down a bit in the next couple of rounds after Farmer survives the round as he doesn't want to rush the finish, and then Farmer recovers a bit as the rounds go on and actually starts to have good moments in the later rounds, and the commentary team are like, oh, and remember in round 1 Tevin Farmer got knocked down and he looked to be out of it, and now he's just schooling Scofield and whipping in big uppercuts and body shots. I'm not saying that's what I envisage per se, but you guys let me know in the comments if you see a world where that happens. But yeah, I'm not going to get all deluded just because I got a prediction horribly wrong and that I lost a bunch of money, and I'm not going to switch up on anyone either. Tevin Farmer's still that as far as I see it, and he'll come back for sure. He's still my guy, and I still look forward to his next fight. And I wasn't a believer in Floyd Scofield before, but I said that I will be if Scofield beats Farmer, and he did beat him, so yeah, my rating for Scofield has gone up greatly. Fair play to the kid. I shall move on from this fight in healthy fashion. It's not like the money that I lost on this fight now means that my gambling losses amount to more money than I currently have to my name or anything. It's not as if this result was so damaging to my reputation that I considered quitting this boxing YouTube shit. It's not as if I stopped drinking over a year ago when I made this channel, but the result of this little boxing match has dragged me back into deep alcoholism. It's not like I'm losing my fucking mind, am I now? There's so much more going on in boxing than we move. Like, look at the 5 vs 5 I just made. There's so much to look forward to. Of course, Tevin Farmer officially being on a 4-fight losing streak is not going to mar my whole relationship with boxing, and it's only really a 1-fight losing streak as far as I see it. Anyway, you guys let me know your take on that 5 vs 5 card I just built, and you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.